Hi folks, welcome to session 26, in which we will discuss private events, some philosophies of behaviorism, and we will start talking about cultural analysis. Let's recap that in the last few sessions we had started talking about complex behaviors and started looking at not just simple three-term causal sequences, but actually much more complex arrangement of these building block contingencies of reinforcement. We talked about choice and preference and discussed the distribution of behavior, and we talked about how it's done in such a manner as to maximize reinforcement. We talked a little bit about how behavior changed, or as we said, matched the density, magnitude, or the reciprocal of the delay of reinforcement. And in that sense, this was a very useful behavior for organisms to engage in, because so many times the environment changed, and in situations where environments changed, flexibility became very important. These were actually the very conditions which favored the selection of operant behavior in general. We also learned that in certain situations we could actually engage in social behaviors of speaker and listener. That is, we engage in individual behavior, but our behavior is affected by others in the sense that reinforcement is mediated by others, and we discussed verbal behavior. And we talked a little bit about how the verbal operants emerged in the analysis, manding versus tacting versus intraverbals. And then we also talked about a further interesting development in terms of how stimuli could actually be classed together, and we could develop what's called equivalent classes and actually build larger units of verbal behavior, all of which, again, affects the range of behaviors that individuals can engage in amongst other individuals to maximize reinforcement. So it stands to reason that in this entire process, when we look at changes in verbal behavior, and in particular vocal apparatus changing, it really wasn't just the development of a vocal apparatus, as you will read in Pearson Cheney, that resulted in the wide range of human verbal behavior in the form of vocal behavior, but it was also the contingencies of reinforcement were changing simultaneously. In and of itself, it's not just so much that you have a vocal aperture and apparatus that could actually emit many more sounds. In the process, conditional discriminations also build larger and larger units. Again, if you recall with Sidman's work, if you teach just a few relationships, you get many relationships. Teach 2 or 3, get 8 or 9. And you could do the math. It only took a matter of time before both changes in the physiology as well as the changes that were happening in the selection process of operant conditioning and discrimination training certainly came together and resulted in what we see today. So when we look at some of the things that individuals say, and imagine if we go back in time, what were some of the things that that folks were talking about? I mean, now you have this fancy vocal cord, and then you have all these conditions. What are you going to talk about? You're going to talk about the weather? Actually, yes, that might be one of the very useful things to talk about. But it stands to reason, amongst the things that a speaker and listener, the type of topics that they might engage in, would be one of the most important ones, food. So you can see, actually, I put this in. This isn't into your PowerPoint presentation, but I always thought Far Side offers some humorous examples of early human life, and you could see here, obviously you got a very large source of food, and there's a little arrow that, well, I shouldn't have to explain this to you. If you're in this class, you should be able to read cartoons yourself. But the joke here is very simple. This is that when you find something useful, you probably not just want to communicate it to another member of your species, but it would last even longer if you actually had an instrument to write it down so that it's transmitted across generations. And of course, what are you going to transmit across generations? Stuff that has to probably do with food, weather, water, tools. Now there's something that's useful, and probably tool use might be something that would be worth transmitting that information. certainly when we look at what we talk about today, one of the things becomes very, very evident when it comes to speaker-listener relationships. That is, listeners generally benefit from the verbal behavior of others. Now, we like to believe this, that when we teach our children, you say, listen to your parents. Your parents know better, so you could learn from our mistakes as well as the things that we did as like our successes. So these are the things that we hope that listeners will benefit from, which is where, and one of the reasons why, listeners ask questions. Because listeners approach other people, and the person speaks and gives the answer, and that hopefully benefits the listener, and there you have it. There's the relationship. And amongst the things that, again, a listener is going to want to know about are reinforcers. It's always happens that when you see a child with a toy, another child runs up and might say, where did you get that? Or if a child has a popsicle and the child says, where did you get that? And the child, might say, I got it from the ice cream man. Or the child might not say anything. They may just simply turn and point in the direction of where they got it. Or the child may actually simply get up and walk over and grab a popsicle and bring it back to the person. Now, what's interesting, by the way, about all these three behaviors, in a sense, you are actually tapping into memory. When a child says, where did you get that? You are asking a child to talk about its previous behavior. And what's interesting about this is that there are three separate behaviors that I just identified, all of which could be called acts of memory. Right? A child is referring to his past of where he or she might have gotten ice cream. The child could do at least one of three things. They could either say nothing, they could point to it, they could say nothing, walk over and get the popsicle, or they could just stand still and say where they got it from. And it's interesting that all three actions involve what we called memory. And we have to kind of think twice about, well, when we talk about memory, is it really one thing? Is it really something cognitive? Is it really one thing that might be physiologically responsible for controlling all three of those different responses? It gets pretty complicated talking about an analysis of things that happen at another level. But we are interested in these things, and we will ask people, amongst other things, not only about what's happening with their behavior, but also things that they've done in the past. What did you do last night? Where did you go? How much did that cost? When did you get? When, and also talk about things in the future. Is that, well, you got this now, or you're going to do this tomorrow? In other words, if you know somebody's going to do something tomorrow with a high reliability and they're your friend, then there's a good chance that you might hook up with them. So if we ask somebody, hey, tomorrow is Martin Luther King Day, are you going up to the slopes to go skiing? And they say, yeah, definitely, positively, that pretty much tells the listener that your friend's going to be up there. If you get in the car and drive there, you may be reinforced by skiing side by side with your buddy. Okay, so there are many reasons why we will ask questions about people, about their reinforcers, about their particular SDs in their lives. And not only the public ones, such as the ones that are obvious to all, but they will also ask questions about private SDs. In other words, private events. What were you thinking? What are you feeling? How do you feel about this? And so forth. Is this something that you desire, or do you sort of not really desire it? And what we're really talking about here are, again, probabilities of people's behaviors, as if more SDs provide more information about predicting people's behaviors. But the real challenge is this. How do we get at those private SDs? What are they? How do we get at them? And that's been a really important question in psychology, but also a question in all of aspects of understanding human behavior that we've been trying to get at for many, many centuries. So that's what we're going to try to talk about today. How do behavior analysts deal with such a tricky problem? I'm going to go ahead here and freeze the camera. Okay. That's an inquisitive look on my face. Not bad, so we could talk about this inquisitive stuff. Let me go over here and advance and start the conversation off this way. Let's go back for a moment and talk a little bit about how we shape verbal behavior about public events. These are the things, again, that are public, that speaker and listener have access to, such as a red ball, both the color red and the object called ball, or a black chair, or a vanilla glazed donut, or chocolate ice cream versus vanilla ice cream. How do we teach that tacting? Well, the way we do that is the fact that all of the objects that I just identified are public. And in that sense, when we tact the public world, such as teaching a person to name objects, in other words, that is tacting, we teach tacting, it's possible to do this because the person and the reinforcing verbal community both have access to the same stimulus. Whether that verbal community is your little brother or your big brother or your big sister or your parents or your teacher or whoever we're talking about here, is that the verbal community and you, the one who's learning to do the tacting, both have access to the stimulus. However, when it comes to tacting private events such as feelings, thoughts, and emotions and sensation, only one person has intimate contact with their own body, and that's you. Okay? You are the one who's very, very closely tied to these, what we call private events or private SDs. These are the stimuli inside of your body. Okay? So, we recognize right from the start that there are limitations in teaching tacts in reference to private events. Now here's the tricky part here. If we go back and look at some of the early ways in which behavior analysts dealt with this problem, it was very early on that behavior analysis was going to be an objective science restricted to the world of observables. At least that was very much the spirit in which John Watson approached the problem, that psychology should be a subject matter only dealing with objective parts of the world. That's all science could actually deal with. And in doing so, whether it was a deliberate act or not, he really did much to rule out an analysis of many things that could not be studied objectively or studied via a machine and so forth and so on. In other words, Watsonian behaviorism really was very restricted in terms of trying to deal with the very things that we're trying to talk about now, these private stimuli, and did so almost as a way to say, well, science can't get at it, therefore science shouldn't really deal with it. And that was really a big mistake, because although we can't get at it the way we might get at public behavior, there are ways in which science can get at private behavior. Now, on the other side of the coin, methodological behaviorism kind of went in the opposite direction and opened up the door to a great deal more of things that were mentalistic and cognitive, and through logical positivism and truth by agreement actually started studying things and talking about things without really being couched in what is very sound scientific language. And what happened here is that along came some of Skinner's writings in which he kind of recognized early on that there was a problem with both approaches. That is, you can't just simply rule the analysis of private events out because science can't get at it. On the other hand, you can't open up the doors to all mentalistic terms by providing something which might appear scientific on the one hand, but really doesn't help out in terms of an analysis on the other hand. And again, it seeks causation at other levels, or it certainly opens up the door for mentalistic explanations to continue. So Skinner tried to really come back and provide a balance between the two and recognize this idea that there are limitations to what we could do. But science can get at it because science might not be able to get at the stimulus, but what science does have access to is verbal behavior. And that might be something more interesting to start looking at. But the question is, what is the verbal behavior that we generate about our own private events? Where does that come from? And do we take what we say literally? In other words, do we take the aspects of introspection seriously when we know that the origins in which a person learns to talk about their behavior is very questionable? So that's the discussion before us. And we note here from the very beginning that the verbal community cannot teach the appropriate distinction to our own body sensations due to something called limited accessibility. Okay? And I want to point out here that this was a very interesting twist that Skinner put onto the problem. He noted here that the problem of limited accessibility is a language problem. It's not a location problem. That is, we don't recognize the problem here as being that which is outside versus that which is inside, or that which is external, which is internal, or that which is, located inside the body versus outside the body. It is not a location problem. It is a language problem in the way science is going to get at it. Okay? The boundaries of private events are the limits beyond which verbal community cannot maintain effective contingencies. In other words, the boundary of a private event is this problem of limited accessibility. It's not a location problem. It's basically a problem in which the verbal community cannot maintain effective contingencies of our ability to talk about them because we just can't really shape accurate verbal behavior about them. So that this boundary does not give these events, these private events, any special status. That is, these are not mental or non-physical events. Private events are responses to our own physiology. So here, this was also extremely important. In recognizing limited accessibility and a problem in getting at it, at the same time, Skinner did not say, because we can't get at it, it must be made of different stuff, which is a big difference than most of the other psychologists who kind of started treating the private events as something completely different than something physical. Okay? So we recognize that when these things are going on inside of your body, these are really physical activity, and it's really our own physiology that we have a very unique perspective on that nobody else really does. Whereas that might be good news that you could see only what's going on inside of you, perhaps. The bad news is that there's real limitations in which how you're going to ever really know what that is, much less talk about what that is. So the limitations to teaching tacts in reference to private events goes like this. Although private events often precede public behavior, and these are really two very important points, that although many times before we engage in public behavior, there is private events that precede the public behavior. And because it's a lot of times we see this private before public, it's very easy to mistake the private event as causing our public behavior. But they really are not causes in and of themselves. It's really somewhat of an illusion, something based on what we call billiard ball causality. That is, when we see a pool table, and by the way, again, this is just simply a term that is borrowed from something that we see physically in the world around us when we see somebody playing pool. We see one ball hits another ball, which hits another ball, which causes the 8 ball to go into the side pocket. Right? And if we were to look at that, we could kind of trace it backward. Why did the 8 ball go into the side pocket? Because that hit the side. The 8 ball was hit by this, which in turn was hit by this, which in turn was hit by this, and so forth and so on. That's billiard ball causality. And when we see that happening externally, we sometimes generate the rule that's the way everything seems to work. But that might not necessarily be the case. Early on in the very first session, I pointed out that there are instances, many instances, is that when we engage in public behavior, we do have private behavior. Before I get up to go to the kitchen to go get myself Oreos and milk, certainly I'm engaged in behavior that I might describe as thinking about it, maybe even craving it. There may even be some of that private taste saying, you know, it would really be good right now, and I could almost taste it. Certainly, I could almost taste things when my wife is cooking, say something like curry vegetables. Boy, that's a pretty potent smell. Or chocolate chip cookies. Those smell really does whet the appetite, and I could almost engage and almost taste it before it actually hits my mouth. But that does not cause me to engage in the behaviors. And one of the things we have to be careful about here is the idea that just because this precedes that, it does not necessarily functionally mean that this causes that to happen. In fact, that's one of the beautiful things about an experimental analysis of behavior. When we bring things under closer examination into laboratory or control conditions, we see things that really just are not conspicuous at first, and now they actually are. I mentioned to you also that there are also instances we all are aware of that you do engage in public behavior, and then there is no private behavior until after the public behavior has happened. You know you have done things, and then you're doing it, and then somebody comes up to you and says, what are you doing? Or they might say, what the heck are you doing? You know, that's pretty much if you're doing something which is a little bit unusual. Or if you do something that has reinforcing effects on people around you, your verbal community, they do something and they eat something you made and say, wow, this is really good. How the heck did you do this? And you really don't know how you did this. You sort of threw a bunch of things together, and that's about the best that you could say. Okay, so there are instances in which you don't have the private behavior until after you've engaged it. You may say to yourself, I didn't even realize what I was doing. All right. What about when you're also driving on a highway and you are going, 80 miles an hour and you see a cop on the side of the road, maybe at just a split second before you're about to pass him and you hit your brake. There's your external operant behavior, right? And then afterwards, you get this flush of all of these, what we call emotional behaviors. Now, a lot of times we get the emotional behavior before we behave, but it goes the other direction too. The problem here is just, again, our reference in all of this is the frequency under which these things happen. By and large, we confront private behavior before public behavior. That happens more often than the opposite, in which we do public behavior before private behavior. And that frame of reference has a great influence on how we actually interpret the causes of our own behavior. And certainly, if this happens at the individual level, it happens at the cultural level. And in the next session, we're going to talk about how our language, our very language that we use, actually clouds the way we interpret behavior and keeps us from looking at other causes of behavior. The thing I also want to point out here, too, is that sometimes we make a distinction of public and private, and it might not even be very useful. It could be that it's all the same stuff. It's all the same behavior. And in fact, the problem of doing what I call online teaching, as you're going through right now, is that when I used to teach this class in a live class, I used to actually stop and show demonstrations to the class where it would be audience participation and show them examples in which their behavior is not necessarily billiard ball causality, or that there are no what we call temporal gaps in behavior that must be filled. I'm going to talk about that in a second. Now, let's talk about it right now. Okay, so here's the first problem. Billiard ball causality. It has a great influence on how we interpret the world around us, but in and of itself, we do not necessarily always say that public and private, one precedes the other, one causes the other. Okay, there are many reasons for causes, and as we mentioned before, the causes of behavior are not the moment-to-moment ones that we think are causing our behavior, but they are much more remote, inconspicuous causes. Our history of reinforcement, as well as our genetic predispositions to say things that are, this pleases me, this tastes good, and so forth. Again, genes and environment play a great role in determining behavior. Okay, the second one, again, is that behavior is controlled by stimuli across a temporal gap. That is, that you could have an event that takes place hours, days, weeks, months in the past, and then doesn't affect behavior until the future. We don't necessarily have to fill that gap with things called memory or mechanisms which are responsible for causing that. We do know that you could actually have events that take place across a temporal gap. Something happens way back when, and you don't see, or there is no manifestation of that happening until much later. This happens, by the way, we've seen these things happen in physics and in chemistry. We talk about things like spontaneous combustion, or what we call the effects of supersaturation, in which you could get something to heat up a little bit at a time, have a very high salt concentration. And when you look at it over this gradual process, it looks as if the water is absolutely clear. But then along comes something 3 or 4 days later or a month later that just accidentally taps that glass. All of that salt all of a sudden falls down. Okay, or a change in temperature causes this to happen. So you could actually see things that have a past, events happen in the past, and then you see its manifestation in the future. But we don't necessarily have to fill those things with mental events called short-term memory, long-term memory, and so forth and so on. Again, it's sufficient to say that events happen in the past that affect behavior in the future. We don't have to fill those things in the same way that we may see that a light is turned off and much later on a light is turned on. When that light is turned off again, we don't say that information about light is stored in the light bulb. It's unusual to talk that way. We say that light is simply emitted. And this is, by the way, the reason why Skinner was very careful in using the word emitted in describing operant behavior, in the sense that behavior appears to be given off. It does not mean that behavior is stored. And again, storage is just one of those things that becomes a perhaps a useful metaphor to describe behavior that is hard to understand. But once we understand the mechanisms of behavior and how it's controlled by events in the past, we do not have to necessarily start filling that gap with mentalistic or cognitive accounts. Okay, went too far. Too far, too quick. Okay. Okay, so given that there are limitations to the verbal community, how they shape verbal responses to private events, what mechanisms do we use? Let's talk about some of these. The first one's called the public accompaniment. And a public accompaniment is just simply at the time at which there is private sensation, there is something physical or public that the verbal community reliably sees that accompanies the private event that they could almost, piggyback onto and use to shape up verbal behavior. For example, when you fall down and you scrape your knee, right? There was the private sensation of scraping your knee because you just fell because you were roller skating, and there is also the conspicuous sign of blood. The same thing holds true when you engage in vomiting. There is the private sensation that we have come to teach people called nausea, and there's the public behavior of vomiting. So when the vomiting happens, the parent or caregiver may come up to the child and say, "Oh, you're throwing up." And at that point, they may try to label that you must feel nauseated, or you feel nauseous, or you feel yucky, whatever terms, your stomach feels sort of yucky. Whatever terms that parents or caregivers may use for children, they try to teach that and shape up that verbal response in the presence of this public manifestation, even though nobody has contact with that so-called nausea but the person who is actually vomiting. And the same thing holds true if you scrape your leg and you say you have a scrape. That must really hurt. That must really smart. That's a scrape pain. Or you cut yourself. And when the same thing holds true, when you burn your hand and you do the same thing, you have a white blister. Oh, that must smart. You see the white blister, they say you must have burned your hand, right? And it starts blistering up, the pain of blistering. So these are ways in which we use public accompaniments to teach these private events, so that children who are crying are able to vocalize a little bit more, and certainly the accuracy of parents in shaping up attack becomes pretty easy when you have what we call these public accompaniments. In other words, that's a good way to get at that. Another way to get at it is that when we have private sensation, we might engage in collateral responses. I'm going to do something I don't always do. I'm going to unfreeze the camera. I have to do this, so here we go. Hello. Welcome back. Okay, so when we have collateral responses, that just simply means is that we're doing something publicly that everybody sees, but it's a response to our own private sensation. For example, if you see me go like this, rubbing my temples, one might see that and say, oh, you must have a headache. Or if I sort of go like this, if I go like this and just have a smile on my face, that's one thing. But if I have a grimace on my face, okay, those two things together, you say, whoa, you have a strained shoulder. Or you might kind of go like this, right? Or, I might go, right? I might have hurt myself. Even though you don't see any kind of public manifestation, that sometimes may actually happen. People might actually see you stand up and kind of walk funny after you've been cross-legged for a while, and people say, oh, look at the way you're walking. What's the matter, your foot asleep? Right? And you walk a little bit gingerly on your foot, even though nobody actually sees your foot being asleep. So those are collateral responses. Okay, now I'm going to freeze myself again here. And okay, so the verbal community could use those as well, but they're not nearly as accurate. A lot of times you could be holding your stomach and a person will say, oh, you must have a bellyache. But, sometimes that may be true and sometimes not. Okay, so you may actually look for inconsistencies. For example, if your child comes to you and the day that they come to you one morning, they're supposed to be going to Water World or Disney World, and this is all planned. Your child comes up holding their stomach and they start crying saying, I've got a real tummy ache. How do we know that the tummy ache is there? Well, there's something seemingly incompatible there. That is, the child's been talking about wanting to go to Disney World or something like that over and over again, and they come to you and say, I don't feel well. One begins to think that maybe there's some, truth in that, versus a child who's been saying, I don't want to go to school, I'm nervous, I don't want to start first grade, I don't want to start first grade, and then the first day of school, the child comes holding their stomach. And then the parent again, it's the same topography, okay? It could be the same topography as what they did going to Disney World. However, the conditions, again, this is contextual control of behavior. Parents know better. So what a parent might do when they can't really trust collateral responses is they go immediately and try to get something which is a deal breaker, the public accompaniment. If they have no other tools, they may say, let me feel your head, right? And they put their head to your head and they can tell whether you have a fever. And again, a fever might be a public accompaniment. But if you're a real clever kid and you really want to get out of going to school, you might go over and get the heating pad and put it on your head before you go tell mom, I'm not feeling well, right? Some of us might have done that. Yes, that's true. Another thing you may do is to have another deal breaker that might be, questionable. If your forehead is cold and your child's head is tepid, then everything's going to feel warm to you, right? So what you may want to do is go get a thermometer. And that's a little bit harder to cheat on that. Now, early in the day when I used to do this, try to get out of something, my mom would leave me, and then I would, I'd be in the room by myself while she'd go, get something in another room. I'd have that thermometer under my mouth, and I'd sit there, try to, do everything possible. Put it under my arm, rub it on the bed sheet, breathe on it, go, I tried to do everything. I couldn't get out of bed and essentially hold it under the stove or something like that. And then, eventually, parents are pretty good at reading their kids' behaviors. And in reading their kids' behavior, they're not reading the behavior, they're reading contextual control. This is a different sort of an SD that's controlling a different behavior here, and parents know better. Another way in which we teach is to use something called extended metaphors. And here, extended metaphors are similar to what I was mentioning before, that Skinner's daughter used to describe the sensation of her foot falling asleep. She learned a metaphor of fizzy on her tongue from soda water. So she said, my foot feels like soda water. It's pretty obvious what she's trying to get at there. And we do this, and we use verbal metaphors all the time. In fact, you'd be hard-pressed to try to describe any kind of a private event without a reference to public behavior. Think about this. How do we describe our own private events? We might say, I have a stomach ache. I have butterflies in my stomach. And again, we are describing the flight or feathery feeling when you're watching, not feathery, but the wings going up and down, the flutter in your stomach, that you have butterflies in your stomach. If you have another pain that you describe, you might describe it as a burning pain. And again, the burning pain comes from the metaphor of when the skin is touching something hot and you get a blister. That's the way it feels in your stomach. A doctor may also ask you, is it a burning pain? No. What kind of pain is it? Is it a piercing pain? Right? A piercing pain is, again, piercing. We see the metaphor in which we see something piercing a membrane or piercing a bag, and when we open up a bag, it's usually a sharp object. So we will borrow that metaphor to describe. It's not a burning pain, it's not a sharp pain. Well, maybe it's another kind of pain, right? So we might also talk about other metaphors. For example, we might talk about a tension headache. You know what a tension headache is, right? That's the metaphor that we use when we see a rubber band, and we pull on both ends of the rubber band, and that's sort of what it feels like in our head. It feels tense. Versus a pounding headache, in which, again, we borrow the metaphor of seeing something which is pounding. Now, you all know the difference between these two things. Even though I've never seen the differentiation in another person, we know where the metaphor comes from. So when somebody says, no, it's not a tension headache, it's more like a pounding headache, we sort of know that. Even if we've never experienced a pounding headache, we have experienced pounding events in our environments, right? So there's where the metaphor comes from. We talk about people who are agitated. When you say, I have a tendency to do things, here what we're actually talking about is similar. Tendency is close to tension, right? And when you have a tendency to do things, you are seemingly pulled in a direction of doing something. Or you may say, I'm leaning towards doing this, which is literally meaning that when you're leaning towards doing something, you tend to go in that particular direction. What about other metaphors like excruciating, having an excruciating headache? Where does that metaphor come from? Well, excruciating is very close to the word crucifixion. In fact, they're very closely tied, okay, and that's where that word comes from. How do we describe sexual activities, or what I should say, the reinforcing effects of sexual contact? We've described these things in various ways. And if you think about it, in the literature, they go to great lengths to try to describe these sorts of things, right? They may, for example, this may be going back before people's times here, but there was a movie From Here to Eternity in which there was a famous scene on the beach. I think it was, who was that? Let me think here. It was Burt Lancaster, maybe, and Deborah Kerr. Can't remember. Anyway, they're on the beach and they're kissing and embracing and they're rolling back and forth in the beach and so forth. And then the scene switches to this wave that builds into a big crescendo and crests and then crashes onto the beach. And we all know what that means, right? We also see that people talk about sex in terms of bottle rockets and 4th of July and so forth. Again, these are just nothing more than metaphors which people, use to borrow those terms because we don't really come in contact with that sensation that other people get. But we sort of use these things loosely. And again, in movies and literature, they use a lot of extended metaphors. But again, the challenge is this. In all of these instances, what you are doing is you are describing physiological activity, and you are referencing certain places in your body. You really have a feeling in your stomach, right? Whether it's butterflies, a gut feeling, tension in your stomach, whatever those things might actually be. People do experiencing things when they talk about heartbreak. And here we are talking about all of the things involved with the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the nervous system. And these are the tools, verbal tools, that we use to tact things that the verbal community can't get access to by borrowing and latching on to public stimuli. Okay? All right. Now, let's go ahead and move on. And let's see here, what do we got? Okay, so when we use these things, we've used some of these verbal repertoires or methods to teach events that we really can't see. Think about relaxation training. There are many ways to teach this. I'm not talking about simply teaching breathing. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about one of the things that we teach is progressive muscle relaxation, Jacobsonian relaxation, in which we don't have access to a person when they say they're relaxed or not, so we may actually teach them polar opposites. We may say, and start from the top, saying, hold your arms straight out and make them real tense. Go ahead and make them as tense as possible. Make them tense, and now let them drop. All right, just let those arms just drop to your side. Okay? And we may do something too where we have our raise our legs. Feel the tension in your leg. You feel that tension? Now let your leg just simply drop away. And we say, you feel that drop away? That's relaxation. So what we do is we try to set up these various differences and we try to see that the person's arms are tense. It's so often I try to teach people relaxation, say, come on, here's how you relax, and say, come on, leave me alone, I am relaxing. And, they're white-knuckled. So the verbal behavior does not really match, or we become suspicious that they say they're relaxed, but everything seems to indicate otherwise. They're walking, they're pacing, they're breathing heavy, and we might even actually have, take their pulse, and their pulse is quite elevated, okay? They may have evidence of tachycardia. So the ways we might teach this, again, is using these things. Or we may actually use other methods, such as biofeedback, right? We might use EMG levels and try to teach people how to relax. In fact, I did some of this work years ago in South Shore Mental Health Center with a guy named Bob Putnam, who did this for his dissertation, working with biofeedback with persons with developmental disabilities to teach relaxation training. Now, what you're really doing here in all of these cases, whether you're doing this progressive muscle relaxation or EMGs or biofeedback, is you are teaching a verbal response to private sensation, but you are just simply adding public accompaniments, biofeedback, EMG digital readouts, or something which is a conspicuous A public accompaniment. Those arms are out and very, very tense. One method I've actually used for teaching people to relax also are I borrow tools like a balloon. And what I will do is I will have a person squeeze a long balloon, and that results in a reaction is that when you are tense and you squeeze, the ends of the balloon puff out. So if you relax, what actually happens when you relax your grip on that, they relax again. So again, I use things like balloons and other things to show public accompaniment so that I say, very good, yes, you are relaxing, and hope that that public accompaniment accompanies the private sensation. Childbirth training also makes use of a great many of these things in terms of trying to teach people to relax. They may choose them to engage in covert conditioning. Think of something pleasant. Think of a focal point. And they'll also supplement when people are going through Lamaze method. I remember we went through this with our kids, although they ended up being cesarean. But I went through the training, and I was amazed. It was very, very behavioral in the way it was arranged. You know, they tried to break many of the private sensations. If you have a focal point, don't just have a focal point. Bring stimuli there. Bring a picture. Bring things that relax you. Things that a smell that relaxes you. All of those sorts of things that might actually serve to reinforce incompatible behaviors to wanting to push when you actually have a contraction. Covert conditioning uses the same thing, and here there's a lot of great research if you want to read some good stuff. The work of Joe Catella, one of the really great behavior therapists, and he did really good research in terms of covert conditioning and using guided imagery to teach relaxation. In particular, his work with June Groden, Catella and Groden, in doing this work with persons with developmental disabilities. Absolutely superb work that we really have not really capitalized on in many of our training. Again, biofeedback uses some of those same tools. And an interesting paper, I don't have time to go into it, by Joe Lang and Paul Andronis, in which they start looking at a functional analysis of very complex speech and thought disorder, again, approaching this from a verbal behavior repertoire. So, as we start looking at the role of teaching people to tack their private events, we are basically trying to see that they are learning maybe what might be called self-awareness. In other words, self-awareness, the ability to talk about oneself or to be conscious about oneself, is an aspect of simply verbal behavior, teaching people to talk about something in which there are no visible public accompaniments and how we go about doing that. But we have to recognize here that when this is all said and done, and we use these methods or variation on this methods, or variations on these methods, we are left with an insurmountable limitation, which is what I want to go through, and then we will end this particular session and then continue this in the last session, session 27. So let's go through what this really comes out to be. The role of being consciousness, or to be conscious of something, is to be able to talk about it. And again, I use these in quotes, okay? I use these in quotes because this is typically the way we have talked about consciousness and things that we talk about. To be conscious of something is to be able to talk about it. Okay? Or more importantly, if we don't talk about it, we do things in terms of behaving with respect to contingencies of reinforcement. Okay? And we transmit rules related to these contingencies. So let's look at a simple example. If I have a buddy and we're walking across the campus at CU Boulder, and we're just walking along, and I see him take a gum wrapper or a piece of gum out of a gum wrapper, puts the gum in his mouth, and just simply throws the wrapper onto the ground. You know, horrible thing to do. You just don't do that. It's pollution, it's littering, and so forth. We learned this in an early age, but apparently this person does this, okay? So I want to do something which is very common practice from the 60s and something which happens in Boulder all the time. We try to raise people's consciousness, right? And when we talk about raising people's consciousness, what exactly are we doing? I mean, how do we know we've achieved the outcome we desired when we set out to raise somebody's consciousness? In other words, what do they do after our type of training that results in us saying, now they get it, their consciousness has officially been raised, whatever that might be. And that results in a couple of things. First of all, the first thing that happens is that that person, after you tell them about this, should pick up the gum wrapper and perhaps throw it into the garbage can. In other words, they have changed their behavior. Is that enough? Well, they changed their behavior, but you're standing there. It might be more appropriate that if we saw the person again, maybe about 30 seconds later, and we watched them do the right behavior, take a piece of gum out and throw it into the garbage can, it might lead us to say, maybe they have changed their behavior, in the sense that I had to tell them before, this time I didn't have to tell them. But that's because I'm standing there also. So perhaps if you followed at a distance and they didn't know you were there and you saw them maybe across the room or in another context, right? You see them, later on that night and they're at a party, you're one side of the room and they're on another side of the room and they're talking to somebody and they take out a piece of gum and they take the wrapper, they put it in a garbage can. We say, in other words, the behavior occurred, number one, without a cue, and number two, in a different context. This is what we talk about with generalization. So now we're getting somewhere. But again, they are able to do it, but now they're sitting there talking to somebody, and somebody that they're talking to takes a piece of gum out, this person who you just taught, and they just demonstrated, by the way, your friend just demonstrated that they put the gum in the wrapper in the right place, but they watch somebody take a piece of gum out and throw the gum wrapper on the floor, and they don't say anything to them. Now we have a problem, because you have not necessarily achieved consciousness, raising consciousness yet. Why? Well, they behave according to the contingencies that you described, but one of the things here is that they should also be able to transmit the rule. Okay, they should be able to talk about it, and they should be able to talk about it under a variety of conditions. So if we saw the person not only behave with respect to the contingency and not change it, and be able to say the rule, I know I should not throw that on the floor, I should throw it in the garbage can, and more importantly, they are able to actually write the rule down or bring other people's behavior under the contingency, and we see this from a distance. You could step back and say, pat yourself on the back, you have just taught somebody the rules around pollution. And when all three of these things seem to be met, it raises the probability that we talk about consciousness, not as something inside the person, but simply that the more conditions that prevail, that this verbal behavior is strengthened and the operant behavior is maintained, it leads us to talk about a behavior that's more enduring. And perhaps, because the way we learn to talk about things, that it happens now at another level. We say that the person embraces the rule, they've internalized the rule, but all you've really done is bring behavior under the control of more inconspicuous sources of control. That's about the best that you could say, okay? Second, to be able to talk about it, you must have been able to talk about it by your verbal community. Our ability to talk about anything comes from our verbal community. They teach us to talk about the world around us. That is what we do when we teach tacting, okay? And in turn, the verbal community must have contact with the same stimulus as you. Thus, that's what makes it a public stimulus. The gum wrapper is pretty much a public stimulus. Thinking about the gum wrapper is not. They don't have contact with your thoughts or the way you look at a gum wrapper or the way you manipulate and touch a gum wrapper. They only have contact with seeing you in the general sense, with the contact with that. And what we end up seeing as a public stimulus are colors, rough sandpaper, salty taste, sweet taste, ringing bells, and so forth. Those are the things that are finer discriminations that we use to describe the stimulus. Like not just a ball, but a red ball. Not just paper, but sandpaper. And not just fine sandpaper, but rough sandpaper, which is defined by the size of the sand that is glued to the page. Okay, a salty taste, a not so salty taste. And we may actually sample this by opening up a bag of regular Roll Gold pretzels and say, this is the salty brand, and then you give them the low salt content. And now you could teach a discrimination based on the public stimulus, in which one pretzel comes out of one bag and one pretzel comes out of the other. So in doing this, the verbal community has contact with only the evoking stimulus. They don't have contact with the sensation. In other words, when this is teaching you salty pretzel, less salty pretzel, we don't have contact with a sensation called salty. We have contact with the evoking stimulus, right? That is a pretzel that on one hand has a lot of salt attached to it, and another one which hardly has any salt. That is the evoking stimulus that we use to teach the response. This tastes saltier than that, not the actual contact of the sodium chloride touching the membranes of the tongue. Okay, and we call this, by the way, one-to-one correspondence. It's isomorphism. That is, in this situation, you see the pretzel, I see the pretzel. You see the pretzel bag, I see the pretzel bag. That's the one correspondence, that it's a visual stimulus. Okay? A person also has a one-to-one correspondence in the sense that their tongue is intact in a certain particular way to be receptive to certain kinds of stimuli. Okay, and we assume that to be the case when that pretzel touches the tongue. Okay, and the same thing holds true when we see colors. We assume that the public stimulus is happening because it is a visual stimulus, and therefore you have your full range of vision between what we would call 4,000 and 7,000 angstroms, which allows us to see colors, right? Those different shades in the bright line spectrum, and so does another person. Now, obviously, things break down when we know a person does not see certain colors, as in the case of being colorblind. And in that situation, you're going to have a hard time actually being able to shape up the response of the color of the ball. So what you're going to have to use are more gross kinds of colors. For example, yellows would probably be more closer to white, and purple and darker colors closer to the extremes on the bright line spectrum. More than likely, you may actually call differentiation based on shapes, okay, not just necessarily colors. Okay, but here, what's very, very important in shaping, and I quote here, accurate tacting, where we teach accurate tacts to public stimuli, is this notion of isomorphism. There's a one-to-one correspondence between, it's a visual stimulus that the listener has contact with, it's a visual stimulus that the speaker has contact with. And I'm going to come back and talk about this later on, okay? 4. The things felt inside the body are physiological behaviors. It is not feelings, they are things that are felt. Okay? They are not these nebulous, mentalistic, fleeting things, but literally things that are felt, and what we are feeling is really the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. We don't have to invent a whole new range of subjective feelings when we already know that we are just simply responding to activity in these two systems. And in that sense, this is where behavior is actually coming very close to linking with the field of neuroscience and looking at neurological research, and much more of the research now, so that when we see the process of conditioning and reinforcement taking place, we're also not only looking at the correlates of operant behavior, the public behavior, but we're also looking at neurological brain activity that lights up when all of these things are going on. Again, it's a closer account that once we have this and we're able to describe it better, we won't necessarily need to be talking in these subjective terms of feelings. These, by the way, are what we call private stimuli. Again, not because of where they're located, not because that it's the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system that take place in the world inside the skin, but the real reason why they're private is because the verbal community never has contact with them, in the sense that it's a one-to-one isomorphism of visual stimulus. Okay? Now, important points coming up. The verbal community cannot adequately shape up accurately verbal behavior about private events. That is, the verbal community cannot teach us the way to a very accurate way to talk about these things. Okay? It is forever a limitation. And I want to point out here that, just as I talked about before, about this neuroimaging and the things that light up, as if technology is going to solve the problem, The problem I'm talking about here is not solvable through technology. That is, this is not a technical problem. It's not invading the physiology and measuring these things, because all we're doing when we are measuring these MRIs and doing these things is we are bringing into play more public accompaniment of the private event, not the private event itself. Okay? So therein lies the difference. When we go ahead and do this research, we recognize that the limitation of privacy is forever going to be a problem that really cannot be solved by science, but can still be talked about. And the only way we're going to be able to get at this problem is to try to increase the number of public accompaniments that might allow us to shape up more and more accurate types of verbal behavior about private events. Okay? Now, that leads to the inescapable problem that in the strictest sense of the word, we will never be conscious of ourselves. Why? Because we have this catch-22 problem that to be conscious is to talk is to be shaped, it's a social product, and because of these limitations, we will never be able to solve this problem. And this has real implications for a couple of things. Number one, introspection. The whole notion of teaching people to talk about themselves, and through talking about what's going on inside is going to solve the problems on the outside. There are clear implications that a person really will not be able to do this with any great degree of accuracy. Secondly, it also has implications for something that we call the self, something that much of modern Western psychology is founded upon. And third, and most important, it has very clear implications for Western thinking in general. The next section we're going to talk about goes through some of these implications. I'm going to stop here because I really need to take a break and I really need to stimulate some private stimuli.